I remember distinctly when I was in high school trying to figure out what was contemporary art. I did a panel discussion in October with Jan Dibbets, a Dutch conceptual artist. There was a show at the Museum of Modern Art last summer called In and Out of Amsterdam. A number of artists did work about time. These were my heroes when I was young, but also the people I reacted against, and were the foil against which I began to develop my ideas about art. I was not yet a photographer. Today I work mostly in photography, but when I was an art student I worked in video, performance, and works on paper. Temporality and time, and actually a reaction against the now, comes from, growing up in a part of the country where the past is more present. Parts of my family were, lived in New England for 200 or 300 years. I had a great aunt who was in her 80s, but she lived as if she was in the 19th century. I was very interested in the past, and specifically the 19th century, so I realized that I could make a project about the 19th century using pages from my great aunt's diary. My father's great-grandmother, Elizabeth, and her husband, James Dixon, they kept a diary together in 1840. And so I began to photograph from the diary. But it's a group of about 60 pictures that are hung in pairs. And there's a picture of a page from a diary written in 1840, and then a landscape photograph taken in southern Connecticut, where my parents lived at the time. So the series involves a stylized image of the present and also a photograph of a diary from 1840. And if you see right here in the first picture, which is called number 13, Diary Landscape 13, there's a flower that's pressed into that page that my great aunt plucked from a site and put flowers and ferns and feathers from where she was visiting. And then you fast forward 35 years or 30 years, and I'm taking flowers and making photograms out of them. So photographing writing is also something that I've always been interested in. Handwriting, graphic marks. Even when I was an undergraduate, I was making Xerox art. I was interested in recording time. I put a camera and looked out of the window of my loft in New York. The camera stayed there for 3 years. It would move around a little bit, but it was pretty much the same view looking east. It's like what they call an urban, asphalt beach. So when I moved back east and lived in New York for 20 years, the proximity to this diary sort of made it less exotic. So I photographed other things. Specifically, I made abstract photographs. And one of the series of photographs that I made were photographs of drapes. From 1981 until, I think it was 2004 or 2005, when I made the author's drapery photographs, I worked every few years. I would do a different drapery project. The initial ones in 1981. Then I made some Polaroids with a 20 by 24 inch Polaroid camera in 1986, 87. In late 90s, I made other drapery works, and then these images involved using negatives that I had made in 1986. But I had the negatives that were not exposed properly. I contact printed them onto film, so I had a positive. And when I printed the image, it became a negative. So all of the works from the author series are negative images. So there's a real graphic quality to those works. They look like etchings or drawings. I could only title these works after authors I could remember. Authors that I liked, too. And Stowe, interestingly, is the opposite of Margaret Fuller. It's the same image, but I printed it backwards and put it in a different color. So in this group of photographs, I was interested in these strange colors around greens, browns, yellows, blues that in some way evoked furniture, fabric, clothing from the 19th century. So my work explores pictures made with cameras and also photograms, which are cameraless pictures. When I began to make photograms in 1999, again, in a series of works called New Abstractions, where I made very geometric images using strips of paper, I also inverted them tonally and made them into positives. I don't know why I do this, except that I know you can. I don't accept the photogram as just a unique transcription of materials on a piece of paper. I like to take that and then make a negative out of, use that as a negative. In 2004, when I began to work with flowers as photograms, I took bunches of flowers that grew next to my house and put them on sheets of 8 by 10 inch film and made negatives first, and then printed them in positive. So to make positives. Yeah, so I printed them all in solid colors because I wanted to work with a color processor and not make them as black and white photograms, but to print them in color. In 2005, I had done a lecture on Andy Warhol for the Dia Art Foundation, and I spoke about Andy Warhol's series of paintings called Shadows, where Warhol took 2 different images of shadows, converted them to a silkscreen, and then printed them on canvases that he had already previously painted. So the silkscreen goes on, and then Warhol paints over it with color. So this idea of introducing arbitrary colors into a black and white picture is sort of where I built the idea for the flowers. The flower, or the idea of the photogram, is something that when I started teaching in 1994, I had never really taught before, 1994, and I was recruited to come out to Los Angeles to teach at UCLA, a program that had a long history of experimental photography practices started by Robert Heineken. So when I came out to Los Angeles, I became very interested in abstract photography, rekindled my interest in abstract photography and also in the photogram. And one of the things the photogram represents for me, that is the cameraless picture, is that it's a different way of making a photograph than a camera or a lens-based image. One of the shortcomings of the way people think about photography today is that it is a narrative art, like filmmaking. It tells stories. Photograph is basically a light-sensitive surface that light falls upon, or shadows fall upon. So when you think of a photograph as only being something that's created by a camera with a lens, you're not looking at all of the potential possibilities that a photograph can be. New York Magazine, they wanted me to photograph the Philip Johnson Glass House. October 2006, I went there and really wasn't sure what I was going to do, and I photographed it with no filters, and then I used filters. And so I really liked what I got. And like, for instance, this first one, 0158, the grass is just blue. I hold a blue filter up over the grass. I went back a month later with more filters and more excitement, and so I began to work with this iconic house with colored filters to change the colors of the grass or the exterior, or this lake pavilion, which I discovered. Even though the glass house is a model of transparency, the lake pavilion is a model of opaqueness, and it's very obscure and weird, bizarre thing that sits in the lake. And this picture, 818, is a good example of all of the things that I'm doing. First of all, I'm putting a yellow filter over the sun and kind of having this starburst sun with a little bit of green up here. It's very simple. It's just a yellow and a green filter. But I'm getting all of these kind of I'm sort of materializing the light, and it looks like these drips and splatters coming down. 4531, I've actually broken the light down into a prismatic kind of, I'm using a diffraction grating which turns the light into the colors of the spectrum.